that migration has always existed and it's here to stay, and this is only the beginning, and it's unstoppable. So by having a closed door policy, you're doing this, you're like, we don't want it, and you're sort of like not actually doing anything sustainable. Hi, I'm Milène Larsson. I'm a producer and reporter for Vice News, and I'm here today to answer your questions about what's being framed as Europe's migrant crisis off the back of our series Europe or Die. So thank you so much for joining the discussion.
Hey, Milène, and thank you for joining the discussion. I know we've got a lot of people online and on Skype who are excited to talk to you.
Great.
So let's just jump right in with Cal, who's calling us from Phoenix, Arizona. Am I right?
Yes.
Hi, Cal.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining.
I have two questions for you this morning, and I guess the first is, where are the majority of the migrants coming from? We hear a lot about Syrian refugees, and also how are they getting to Europe? What's the main mode of transport?
Okay, so this year, I guess you're talking about, what we're talking about when we talk about the migrant crisis are the people who enter Europe irregularly, because there are a lot of people who sort of overstay their visas and fly in. That's actually the majority of people who come to Europe. But irregularly this year, we've had 670,000 people coming in so far. The majority of them are Syrians, Afghans, and Eritreans. But then you also have people, so you actually divide people that enter Europe between refugees and so-called, what's being labeled, economic migrants. This is not necessarily fair because people who are leaving their countries usually do so for survival. But yes, so that was to answer who comes to Europe this way. And the way that people come to Europe, because Europe has had a closed border policy for more than 25 years, people can't actually enter Europe legally, which is a little bit of a paradox because Europe actually offers refugees asylum once they reach European soil, and there's also an enormous pull factor in Europe's so-called shadow economy. There are a lot of jobs, clandestine work within sort of agriculture and construction. So you have a lot of reasons for people to want to come to Europe, but guess what? There are actually no legal ways to enter. So this is part of the reason why we're seeing this so-called crisis, because people are forced to enter irregularly. So they're actually pushed to pay people smugglers to get them into Europe. And these people do know how to circumvent the various physical and bureaucratic barriers that Europe has set up to deter people. So there are three main routes into Europe. It's the biggest one right now is the Eastern Mediterranean route from Turkey into Greece and Bulgaria. Then you have the Central Mediterranean route, which is mainly from Libya to southern Italy, and then the Western Mediterranean, which is mainly from Morocco into Spain. And these routes, people either take boats, which is, we see this is very dangerous, or they cross the land borders.
Thank you. My second question is, and you kind of touched on this a little already, we know that Hungary has closed its borders with Croatia, and a lot of Eastern European countries have been extremely resistant to accepting any migrants within their borders. But seeing as how the migrant crisis is ongoing, what kind of long-term repercussions might you see from these border closures and resistance to help, both in terms of the migrant crisis itself and also in political relationships in the European Union and elsewhere?
Well, we're actually already seeing the long-term repercussions of this closed-door policy, because I just want to take back this. In this question, it's important to remember two crucial points which Europe are completely neglecting. One is that migration has always existed, and it's here to stay, and this is only the beginning, and it's unstoppable. So by having a closed-door policy, you're doing this, you're like, we don't want it, and you're sort of like not actually doing anything sustainable that will work. And the second crucial thing is that the whole point of having border control is to control who comes in and out of your borders. Now, with the closed door policy that we have invested many billions of taxpayers' money into, which mainly which a lot of it goes into the hands of arms manufacturers. The problem with this is that, as we can see, it hasn't worked, because when you ignore the fact that people will come and they will risk their lives, and that they don't care about the risks that are out there, the fences, the deadly seas, and so on, you actually have this problem where people come in completely usually unchecked by using people traffickers, and so they sort of break the border and it's uncontrolled. And then once they break this border, we had a bureaucratic border called the Dublin Regulation, which means that people have to stay and apply for asylum in the first country in Europe that they enter. Now, of course, when people enter countries like Greece that are already in a very deteriorating financial crisis, and Italy that is also in financial crisis, and there are not many prospects, and the reason they even came to Europe was to find a future for their families and to find work. Of course, they're going to not want to stay there, and they're going to want to sort of move further up into Europe, and then obviously you have these people going like, what? So then you have the problem sort of escalating and spreading throughout Europe, because of course, as we can see, closing borders is a fantasy. It doesn't work.
All right, I think that answers my question.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Cal. So, Milène, you just actually mentioned Greece, and we got a message on Skype from one of our Greek viewers, Georgios. His family is from the island of Lesbos, but he wants to know, do you think that European national leaders are acting in line with public opinion when it comes to refugees or migrants? He says that the people of Europe overwhelmingly support both nativism and restrictions on migration, while politicians like Angela Merkel continue to push for increased intakes of migrants. He also wants to know if you think that migrants are going to integrate into the labor force of Europe quickly enough to be productive and not, without a job. What do you think?
Yeah, these are really good questions. I'm going to answer them one by one. So you said you're from Lesbos, from Greece. So I'm going to your first question, do the European national leaders act in line with the public opinion? Well, unfortunately, they do. And you're from Greece, you have the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who was talking a lot about rhetorics, which is something that plays a huge part when it comes to sort of drumming up votes, public, support for your party. And the sort of debate when it comes to migration has, for the past decades in Europe, been completely hijacked by nationalist parties who use the very powerful political tool of fear of the other. Sadly, rather than being pragmatic, which is the whole point of rhetorics, people will listen more to what makes emotional sense than rational sense. So people are afraid of the idea of the other, and this is what is actually stopping Europe to sort of have a more modern outlook on migration and what you should do with borders and border control, because of course that would be political suicide when the majority of people will vote for a party that will protect them from, demographic, whatever, that will bring in, I guess there's like a big hatred. There's Pegida, they don't like Muslims, a lot of the Syrian refugees are Muslims, and so on. So, of course, this plays a huge part in why nothing or not enough is being done. The people of Europe overwhelmingly support both nativism and restrictions on migration, while politicians such as Merkel. Okay, so Merkel has a pragmatic response. She was a refugee from Eastern Germany herself. She kind of sees that these people are coming anyway, what we're doing isn't working. I just imagine this is how she's thinking. So she tried something else. She was like, okay, let's let them in. Of course, this causes problems when one country is taking the kind of responsibility that the entire European Union should be taking, because when you divide all of the people that came in, 670,000 people today, on 28 member states, suddenly it's not that many people. It's like less than 25,000, but because Germany and countries like Germany and Sweden are the countries that accept refugees, then of course they will be sort of overwhelmed and will lack the capacity to take them all in, which causes various issues. And then integrate into the labor market. Well, I guess the problem also that people see is that it costs a lot of money to take refugees in. Well, the thing is that it costs a lot of money in the beginning, but according to reports by the OECD, also we've had the European Central Bank talking about this, the real crisis Europe is facing is actually a demographic one. We will soon not have enough people in our workforce. So if instead of spending all these billions of tax money to sort of build various security policies to protect our borders, which by the way isn't working, if we would invest this in integrating people who come here, they could actually contribute to our economy, pay tax and so on, and it will be a pretty good situation for everyone.
All right. Well, George, thank you for that question. I hope we answered that for you. So let's move on to our next person we've got here, and that is my friend David calling us in Buenos Aires, Argentina. David, you still there?
Yep, I'm here. Hey, hi,
Milène.
Milène.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to meet you and glad to be at Vice News Live. My first question is, how long can a refugee stay in the host country?
Well, that depends. So, for example, Sweden gives Syrians, they did this for Iraqis before, gives Syrians just asylum and the permanent stay if they have their asylum application granted. In Germany, it's 3 years to begin with, and then the asylum request will be reassessed depending on the situation in Syria. I think the Swedish answer to this model is probably the one that makes more sense, because if you have 800,000 refugees coming into Germany just in 1 year, you'll have to sort of fly millions of people back to Syria. I don't think taxpayers will want to do that. But yes, so if you do get your asylum application granted, you can stay.
Okay, my second question is, can refugees acquire a nationality status after a certain time? Like, maybe war in Syria ends, like someday, or Libya, and can they give them the country like a nationality status, or no, like the host countries?
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on that particular field, but when you get asylum to stay permanently, you will obviously eventually get a nationality. But I think, if the conflict in Syria ends anytime soon, it's going to take decades to rebuild the country because it's been so destroyed. Sure. I don't know. That's more for politicians to answer. But I hope that people will want to go back and, rebuild their country, of course.
Yeah, sure. And one last question. What are the criteria the European Union used to give asylum seekers a refugee status? Because, there are certain things that refugees have to have, if they're persecuted political or religiously. So does every country have the same criteria to give a asylum seeker refugee status?
Well, so it's a bit complicated. So basically, all the countries in Europe are signatories to the UN Refugee Convention from 1951, which means that anyone who can be persecuted for their, sexuality, religion, or if they're fleeing political beliefs or fleeing conflict, has the right to asylum. But now, because we have something that is a very important thing that everybody needs to think more about, there's no real sort of accountability mechanism. It's not a very sexy word, but there's not much to reinforce that this actually happens. We have human rights courts and so on, but then you have countries who have their own interests and will make decisions based on what they call safe countries. So for example, despite there being full-blown conflict in Afghanistan, I believe that there are countries who do not consider Afghanistan as a country from which you can get refugee status. So it's a bit complicated in that sense.
Okay, that answered my question. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks, David. Calling all the way from Argentina. The internet's so cool. All right, so I'm not Naxioma Tapioca. I don't think that's their real name. sent us this tweet, and they're asking, Milène, why aren't rich Muslim countries financially helping or providing host destinations to a lot of these refugees? I saw a lot of people asking similar iterations of this question. So basically, why aren't more of these refugees and migrants heading to their neighboring Muslim countries?
Well, it's two separate questions. For example, the Gulf states do actually give a lot of money in aid to Syrian refugees. There was also this thing that spread like wildfire on social media, where they're donating millions and millions to build mosques in Europe, which is kind of ironic. That to go to your second question, why aren't they accepting refugees? Well, basically, they are not signatories to the UN refugee convention, and that means that they do not recognize refugees, and it's quite tricky to get visas to countries like Saudi Arabia. You need to have a work visa, or you need to have family there. You can't actually apply for asylum, so you do not have the rights and the support to, if you take Syrian refugees, for example, like they're in this situation where their country is completely destroyed and they're not going to see a future there for their children, which they of course want to go to school and have access to healthcare and food and fresh water. So they need to make sure that they get all the support they need to have a viable future for their families. So because that will be very difficult in these countries, Europe seems like a better option. Now, this doesn't mean, this is a very good question, because Europe should not have to deal with this refugee emergency alone. There needs to be much more responsibility taken from countries across the world, of course. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope that answered your question there. So, let's say hey now to Elise, who's calling us on Skype. I know she's got a couple more questions for you about what we can do to help.
Hi, Elise.
Hi there. How's it going?
I'm good, thank you.
Oh, I loved your piece on punk versus Sharia. So my question is, what do those who've been left behind in Syria face over the coming years?
Well, I haven't been to Syria personally, but I think everyone can imagine what happens when you have various factions fighting each other, and now you have, messed up foreign policy from the West, where Russia goes in, and this morning there were reports on Russian bombings on 3 hospitals and so on, trying to reinstate Assad, a leader who A, most of the population doesn't want reinstated, and B, who uses chemical weapons and barrel bombs on his own population. So it's and you also have Islamic State, and you have various rebel groups. They're facing a deteriorating chaos, and that's what they're facing.
Well, this sort of is a good follow-up to that. Then, what, if anything, can we do to help the people, not only the refugees, but those who've been internally displaced as well?
Yes. Well, the UN's World Food Programme has continuously warned that they're running out of resources. In September, they actually do bring, as far as I know, food and various aid into Syria, as well as into the neighboring countries that have the biggest refugee camps, because we think that Europe takes in most refugees, but actually there are almost 2 million Syrian refugees in Syria, over 1 million in very small countries like Lebanon, almost 1 million in Jordan, and they have enormous refugee camps there that are actually not getting enough resources or food. You even have this crazy situation where you have Syrian families who are leaving the refugee camps to go back into Syria to sell whatever they have left to get enough money to go into Europe, because they can't stay in the camps. So of course there's this urgent need for more money, and the EU is actually recently decided to give more money to aid, but also it needs to be much more. It's just too little, too late. But also, no matter how much more money and resources you give to keep people alive, it's still not sustainable, because Syria is not going to be fixed anytime soon. So you need to think about relocating people, because you could also look at it, I mean, of course, yes, aid is needed and it's needed urgently, but you also need to think about, do you continue investing money into aid, or do you see a more sort of sustainable solution, which will have to happen eventually anyway, relocating people to various countries across the world. Of course, this is a complicated one because we do have the United Nations and we have the EU. The problem is that they are completely relying on the collaboration of its member countries, member states. And unless there's more political will, and that also comes from the people who elect their leaders to receive people in need, not much is going to happen, and actually more money is being invested in sort of what people call or refer to as band-aid solutions rather than sustainable solutions that could be better for everyone and do a lot less harm to people who are in need, because it's completely ridiculous. I mean, the image of 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, the little Syrian boy who was found dead on a beach, caused a lot of public outrage, and that's because it symbolizes this paradox of these closed border policies where you have families who escaped Islamic State, who escaped Assad, and who die on a boat on their way to safety. That is a situation that we shouldn't see in 2015. We also shouldn't see these same families who have survived all of these things and the boat journey and the chaos in Greece with not enough resources to receive them, to then come further into Europe and be tear gassed and stopped by various forces. It's just this like vicious circle of suffering, and it's the most vulnerable people who are affected by this. So yes, there needs to be a lot more responsibility and a lot more attention to this, and a lot less belief in all this fear-mongering by nationalist parties. And I actually think that Europe can solve this. Like Europe, I'm a proud European. We have actually really good human rights standards. We have functioning democracies. It's just the sort of political will to collaborate and just stop doing this, stop doing like, oh, close the borders, we don't want people, and just like, okay, so people are here, how can we make this an opportunity instead of a threat? An anthropologist that we're interviewing for the feature-length film that's about to come out, that we're assembling the series Europe or Die, and we're going to put out the film hopefully early next year. He has a really good quote, which is, right now the policies of Europe is to see people as a threat and the border as vulnerable, when the reality should be the opposite. And to quote the European Commission on Migration, Dimitris Avramopoulos, he said also, let's make sure we are not on the wrong side of history.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was very interesting.
Thank you for joining.
You definitely answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. So, Milène, got one more tweet I wanted to show you before we wrap up the show. We just got this in from Mateo, and I think this is a good one for a journalist to address. Do you think that the news cycle is an enemy, or the worst enemy, of refugees making their way to Europe? How do you think the news cycle impacts refugees?
Well, actually, this is a really good question. I mean, we are completely overwhelmed by news. We're just having information thrown at us, and we're not giving enough time to sort of assess this information and put it into context. And, everybody, I mean, including Vice News, uses migrant crisis. I mean, when actually we're not necessarily seeing a migrant crisis, we're seeing a migrant emergency, a humanitarian crisis, but we're actually seeing a political crisis. And by playing into sort of politicians' fear-mongering, calling this a crisis, and using migration as a security policy, and we have like borders, and they're coming in, they're breaking into the borders. Well, when you use that terminology, you do make people think of the people coming here as the other. So yes, I mean, but at the same time, it is also a very important tool to show this information, to show what's happening. I mean, there's a lot of news that's report. I mean, if we didn't have news reporting on how many people are dying trying to reach Europe, if you didn't have news on how much aid is needed in the southern countries of Europe right now, who are not having enough resources to receive people, or outside of Europe, you also wouldn't have the will of the public to sort of push the politicians to help. So, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but there should be more responsibility in the news cycle on how you tackle these issues to make sure that you do not play into sort of far-right propaganda.
Well, I don't think I could have asked for a better answer, and I hope, Matteo, you're happy with that answer too. So, Milène, made it to the end of the show. So why don't you say goodbye to everybody watching at home?
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
C'est vraiment difficile. Il faut rentrer dans les forêts, passer comme ça, parfois passer dans l'eau pour déjouer de l'armée, les gardes, je sais pas. Pourquoi ces frontières? Maintenant, il y a les frontières même dans l'eau. On te dit ici, il y a la frontière. Dans l'eau, tu vois la mer. On te dit il y a une frontière. Tu vois les airs. On te dit qu'il y a les frontières même dans les airs. Mais qu'on ne devrait pas défendre à un humain de passer un chemin à l'autre. Mais bon, c'est comme ça.